Hey everyone, in this series we're going to take a look at how to make a 2D castle defense game. To begin with, both castles will be on the same screen, so your castle will be on the left, the enemy will be on the right. And then the reason why we do that is because it makes it easier to troubleshoot certain functionality, such as collision detection. What we'll do in a later video, we'll then move the enemy castle off the screen so that you have to scroll over to get to it, making the battlefield larger. But again, game design is an iterative process. You want to test the basic functionality and then build on top of it. Likewise, the same goes for the visuals. These are very rudimentary graphics. You don't want to be spending a lot of time and financial resources making assets for a game that might not even work. So it's always a best practice to start with placeholder graphics. In a later video, we'll add animation as well. So let's get started. First, let's add the ground. So we'll take our ground image. It's just a white box. It too was drawn in an external paint program. The reason why you use white is because you can change it to whatever color you want. This is pretty typical and has been done in video games for years. If you think of like an old school RPG, there were say like blue slimes and green slimes and yellow slimes and red slimes. The slime was probably actually white, and then they just changed the color. That way they didn't have to redraw it. So same thing, say you want brown for the ground in some levels, you want green in others, maybe some are going to be icy and you make them blue. Well, by starting with white, you can just come over to the inspector while you have that object selected, and for the sprite renderer, for color, you just click on this and you choose whatever color you want. We'll start with green. You can see it's now green. So let's now widen this so it's the width of the screen. So let's change scale to like, say, 24. And when we make the battlefield wider, then obviously we'll have to scale this wider. Because this is a solid color, we can just scale this. If this was an image, then we'd actually have to repeat it because scaling it wouldn't make it look right. It'd be stretched. So let's take our castle image, drag that into the hierarchy. We'll move that over here. And now we'll do that again for the enemy castle. And again, right now, both castles look the same. You can always swap out the enemy castle if you want it to look different. Again, this is all about functionality, not about aesthetics. You can flip this using the sprite renderer. You can flip X. So now the castles are facing each other. So now we have the basic battlefield in place. Next, what we need to do is we need to give you the ability to spawn what units you want. To begin with, there's going to be a soldier, a catapult, and an archer. So what's going to happen is we'll have them listed up here in the upper left corner, and you can just click on which one you want, and that will cause the corresponding unit to spawn here and start traveling across the screen. Now, in your final game, you'll probably want to have a separate image that you don't want this to look identical to this. Like if you're taking like a card approach, maybe it'll be a little bit more detailed, a little more artistic, that kind of thing. Also, it might have the cost associated with it. So say whatever unit of resource we're using, okay? Maybe this costs 1, this costs 2, this costs 5. So the image would also have that number on it so you know how much it would cost and provide that information to the player. But for now, we'll just drag the images up there. So we'll put the soldier up there. We'll put the archer up there. And we can line these up more precisely like this is. Let's make it just y of 4. Y of 4. So that's the height. The cat. Sorry, I didn't mean to open that. That's what happens when you double click on it. We'll put this up here. Should also be a y of 4. Now, as you can see, this one is wider than the other one, so that's something to keep in mind too, that when you draw your card, you'd really want to keep these a consistent size. We can do that if we want, like we could scale this to say, 0.5 maybe. And again, the final version you won't have to scale because you'll draw it with a standardized size. Okay, so now we have the basic UI. And before I go any further, I do want to say that yes, Unity has a UI layer. I personally find it completely and utterly unnecessary to use the UI layer in a 2D game. The UI layer is very important for 3D games, so you can have this 2D interface overlaid to the 3D environment. But when you have a 2D game, I find it adds unnecessary complexities in that it's easy enough just to add a collider and then functionality associated with when the collision occurs. Well, I say collider. You would add a collider box, but then you add a function that says if the left mouse clicks on this, then something happens. I find it actually simpler to do it by hand than to use the UI layer. Let's now add those colliders that I mentioned. So let's select all three of those. And the way you do that is you can just click on one and then you shift click down the list. All three are now selected. So what we're going to do, we're going to add a collider to each one. So add component, physics 2D, make sure you're using 2D, and then we'll do box collider 2D, and then you can see the boxes each appear. Now, one problem with this border exactly lines up with this border, and you really don't want to do that. You want to make sure that there's a margin of error. So now that you've put the collider in places, you can kind of tweak these. So with the box collider 2D component, you can click on Edit Collider, and you can just pull these in. Now, you can do a more form-fitting collider because rather than doing box collider, you could use polygon collider, which tries to draw the exact shape. But then a dead zone like this, you wouldn't be able to click on, and we do want you to be able to click in a consistent area, that you don't have to be pixel perfect with where you're clicking. So we'll do the same thing with this one. The box collider 2D, we click on Edit Collider, and we'll just bring the sides in. So now there should be a dead zone between there where you don't accidentally click on the wrong one. And then this one's actually already selected, but we'll click on the collider and move this up just so it's consistent vertically. And again, that's important, the consistency of the UI. So let's click on all three now. So this one doesn't quite go high enough. We'll tweak that a little bit. And you probably won't have to do these adjustments if you're using an actual card image, because the box collider conforms to the basic size of the image. So not the pixels, but the actual size of the image. So these would all come out to the same size to begin with if you're using a consistent card. Okay, so now we have the selectors at the top, and when we click on one, it needs to spawn something. Well, let's now go to... Let's create the actual soldiers now before we try doing any coding. So we'll take our soldier guy. Now what we're going to do is when you have something that gets called over and over and over again, you're going to create what's known as a prefab. So the prefab won't be in the scene to begin with. It's going to be an asset that can be summoned. So when you hear that something has been spawned, the actual functionality is called instantiate. You're going to instantiate that object. So spawning, instantiate. So what are we going to do? Well, we want our soldier to basically appear right there. And then what we want the soldier to do, we want it to travel over, and then we want it to stop at a certain point. And when it stops, it starts to attack the enemy castle. So as I said, there won't be an animation to begin with. It's just going to look for a collision, and then it's going to do damage over a certain delay. So think of it as the attack speed. So what we need to do, we need to do a few things. We need to give him a collider, so just as we gave them a collider. So add component, physics 2D, box collider. We'll keep his collider the same for now. You can always tweak how precise you want it to be later. So we did that now, but you don't have to. So This enables collision detection. But we also need movement, so that's a different type of component. Add component, physics 2D, that's known as a rigid body. That allows for the application of velocity and gravity. Speaking of which, we're not going to use gravity. So for the rigid body 2D, you do gravity scale 0. There's just no gravity being used. Now what we need to do is we need him to, as soon as he appears, to start to move to the right. So he'll be moving along the x-axis in a positive direction. So see how this says position -7? Watch what happens when I move him over. It's now +5, so it's moving in a positive direction along the x-axis. So what we need is a script that does that at a certain rate. So right-click, create, C#, shows up down here, and we'll call this melee con for control. We click on our soldier. We add the component. So a script is just another component. It's just that you have to go to a different interface to use it. It should automatically open up Visual Studio. Okay, wherever you see these double forward slashes, that means it's a remark. In other words, it doesn't actually get executed. It's internal documentation. This simply says that start only gets run once when the object that's attached to it gets instantiated. So we don't need that anymore. This says that the update section will be run once per frame. So we don't need that anymore because we know that. So what we're saying is that as soon as this object is instantiated, we want something to happen. So what we're going to do, get component. Remember how we said that in the inspector you see components? It's not a coincidence that we're using a phrase that says get component, because that's what you're doing. You're going to get one of those components. So get component, which one? Well, the rigid body 2D. And do make sure that you're differentiating between 2D and the 3D, or else it won't work. So get component, rigid body 2D. We're just going to add velocity. And it's going to be, we said it's moving in a positive direction. And it's not moving vertically. And there is no z-axis. So actually, sorry about that, getting ahead of myself. New vector 2, in other words, there's two vectors. There's only x and there's y. There's no z. Z is only for if you have a third dimension. So sorry about that. So get component, rigid body 2D, velocity equals new velocity, new vector 2, 1, 0. So positive horizontal velocity, no vertical velocity. And that will already make the soldier move. So the script is attached to the soldier. Let's run it. Now at this point, you start to get into what's known as game balance. So you may find this too slow. You may find this too fast. You really don't want to tinker too much with that yet, because basically you want to just have the basic functionality. So be very careful about going down the rabbit hole of that kind of fine-tuning game balance when you're still in the initial stages of the game. So just like that, we have a soldier that moves. Now he'll keep moving, and we really need him to stop. So that brings up a couple other things. So first of all, our castles don't have any collider boxes. So first, let's use a box collider for the moment. So I'm clicking on the castle, Physics 2D, box collider. As I said, you could use a polygon collider, but we really don't want that kind of precision for a game like this. In fact, what you probably want, so everything, you still want to see what's coming out of the castle. So you really want the soldiers to stop just ahead of the castle and attack. So this is fine. So let's do the same thing for this one. Add Physics 2D. Box collider 2D. So what's going to happen is when he collides with this, he'll stop just outside the castle and start swinging his sword once we add that animation. This way you can still see what's spawning out of the castle, so you don't want it to be like right on top of it. You can if you want, that's a design decision. I suppose another thing you could do is you could actually have the soldiers stop in random positions surrounding the castle and hitting it, but then that makes much messier when it comes to having the soldiers that come out and attack them, so I really don't recommend that. And so that this guy doesn't spawn, yeah, that's fine. What we'll do is we'll take him and we will turn his collider box into a trigger. In other words, it's not solid. So there's two kind of basic triggers. When you think of two solids hitting each other, like a car crash, they both stop. Another kind of trigger is when one is passing through another, like walking through fog, walking through gas, fire, whatever, that you want a collision to be detected, but you don't want it to stop them. This one will also be a trigger. So what happens is, since it will pass through it, we need there to be something that says stop. So we're going to add what's known as a tag. So with this object selected, we're going to add a tag. Now this is really a two-step process. So even though I'm going to choose add tag, that just creates the tag. I then have to go back and select it. So we'll, where it says list is empty, we're going to click on the plus sign, and we're going to call this enemy castle. And be careful about making the tag names too long, because you could accidentally type out the wrong tag name and then it won't find it. So we'll save that. We click on our object again, and as you can see, it still says untagged. So even though you're saying adding tag, that just means you're creating the tag to begin with. Now we tag it as enemy castle. So what we're going to do is when he collides with this, we're going to say stop, and then we'll get into the attack sequence at that point. No animation at this point, but it will start doing damage over time. That is the attack rate. All right, so how do we do that? On, trigger, enter. Sorry, I actually messed that up. I did the very thing that I said to be careful of. On, trigger, enter, 2D. Very, very sorry. And this other stuff pre-populates, again, because it's Visual Studio. So make sure you're using that. On, trigger, enter, collider, 2D. I personally don't like the fact that this defaults to collision, because this is actually referring to whatever you're colliding with. So you'll see a lot of people do this. They'll change it to other. And we have extra of these in here because I had typed that out twice. So if other, well, what attribute the other? Well, we just added a tag. If other.tag equals, yes, it has to be a double equal sign. And we said it was enemy castle. And this was what I was talking about. You have to be careful that you don't, if you make the tag too long, it makes it more likely that you're going to do a typo. So if the enemy tag if the tag of the object that's being collided with is enemy castle, then what we want to do is we're going to take this, we're going to repeat it, but it's 0. Now it does not have any motion. And just so you know, when you're using if statements, if you only have one line following the if statement, you don't have to use these squiggly brackets. But in all likelihood, I'm going to trigger something after it stops, so there will more than likely be something else going on there. So what we're going to do now, we go back to our project. And this should automatically, again, move on its own. And then when it reaches the castle, it should stop. And actually, just so this doesn't take forever, we'll just bump this up to 3 for the moment. Again, to make debugging and testing less tedious. There you go. It stops, and then at that point, it will start attacking. So what we want to do now is we were leading up to this because we said we want this to be a prefab. So all you have to do to make this as a prefab, you click on it, you drag it, you drop it into the asset area, and now it's a prefab. You have now created one of your attacking units. You can delete the one from the scene. The only thing I do want to say is that this is obviously not complete, and so there's going to be additional functionality, but you don't have to recreate that. You can just start piling more stuff into the script. So as long as you're modifying the prefab and the script is attached to the prefab, then all those changes will cascade into every time you instantiate, you spawn that unit. So we said that we gave this its box collider. We will also set it to be a trigger, and then we will give it its own script. Create C# script, and we'll call this. You've got a couple ways you can do about you could do this. You can make a single script for all the buttons at the top, or you can do one for each. Let's do one for each for now. That way we don't have to check what's being clicked on. 6 one way, 1 half dozen the other. You either have one script that has more complex code, or you have multiple scripts with less complex code. So we'll call this melee BUT for button. That would be nice if I could spell. Try 2 E's. Not there. Okay. So what we do is we take him, we attach that script to it, and now we open up that script. So we open up that script. Again, you can get rid of the remark statements. Now for this, what we want to happen, we want to have on mouse down. This one does not differentiate between 3D and 2D. So on mouse down, and this basically says if the left mouse, if the mouse pointer is pointing at the object the script is attached to, and the left mouse is clicked while it's pointing at this object, you want something to happen. We're going to instantiate an object. We're going to spawn an object. So first, we need a variable to refer to that object. So it will be a public transform, and it will be melee soldier. So we save this. And then in the on mouse down section, we say instantiate that. So we start typing and now it will show up. So melee soldier. So there's 3 arguments. What's being instantiated? Melee soldier. Where it's being instantiated. Let's use the melee soldier's position, because we positioned it right outside of the castle. And then the melee soldier's rotation. So what's being instantiated, where it's being instantiated, and the rotation of where it's being instantiated. This works out because we want the soldier to be instantiated using its default values. You may not want that. You might actually want this to be instantiated somewhere else. So now, that should let us make our soldier, if I haven't forgotten anything. Actually, sorry, one last step. Got ahead of myself. So, with our button here, see how we created that variable? Well, I didn't actually put the soldier there yet. So you take the prefab, put him there, and now it should work. Just like that. So again, it's not much to look at, but now you have the core functionality of having a UI where you can spawn units of your choice. They show up and they start to automatically attack the enemy castle. Now, obviously, he's not doing any damage yet, and we haven't added the other ones yet. These will be more complex because he will stop, like, say, here, and then shoot arrows, which is what that's the whole idea, is it doesn't have to go as far to attack. And then the catapult will probably stay over here and shoot even further. Now, a lot to do. Like, for instance, we haven't added the counter to decide what rate you're getting resources and what the cost of these are, because I could just do this. Clearly that's a problem. So I don't want to exaggerate how much we've gotten accomplished, but also, keep in mind, you've gotten a lot done in whatever the length of this video is, under 30 minutes. So probably a good place to stop for now. And in the next video, what we'll do is we'll actually add the attack functionality for him. And we will also add whatever the rate in which you're getting resources. Typically, you get resources at a certain normal rate. And then every time you defeat an enemy unit, you get additional resources, which means we'll have to add enemy units. Probably won't add enemy units until the third video. So the second video will add the natural resource gain, the damage to the castle reaching 0. So then in the third video, we'll add the enemies. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this so far. I hope this is helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions or if you have any functionality that you want to see. Again, I ask you to be patient with me for the first couple of videos because it's going to be very rudimentary, and I do intend on adding greater functionality as the series progresses. And so please enjoy the rest of your day.